This is our last presentation for the day. I'd like to invite Mark Lim. Mark is presenting on evaluating reef governance challenges and prospects. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you for having me here today. 6-minute presentation, very challenging, and fortunately, hopefully means I can't get into too much trouble. But considering I am not really a reef expert, I'm an urban planner and I'm quite new to the space, I guess we'll see how that goes. Fortunately, I am working with some esteemed colleagues in this space, as you can see up here, who will hopefully keep me somewhat on track with the reef. But today I want to talk about evaluating governance, which is kind of it's perhaps a fitting topic to have at the end of these short series of lectures. And typically that's often where a lot of evaluation occurs, right? And ultimately with evaluation we're wondering, well, did the plans that we're producing, are they working? Are they achieving what we hoped? But I think perhaps more critically is, what does working mean and how do we define that? Before I move on, I'd firstly just like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land I'm visiting today, the Bindil and Wulgurukaba, did I say that right? Wulgurukaba people for where this conference is being held, as well as acknowledging and paying respects to the Turrbal and Yagara people back in Minjin, or Brisbane, where I am from. I've got sort of double thing going on here. So quick overview. It's going to be a whirlwind tour here. First I want to quickly talk about the fundamental challenges in a general sense of evaluating governance. Very quickly gloss over some recent experiences before I sort of talk about what I'd like to introduce, which is about some of the approaches used in spatial planning, which I hope might be of value here. So this is in a general sense. This isn't to sort of point at a particular plan here as such, but typically the challenges of evaluating governance, it can be quite difficult, and it often comes down to a matter of the plan quality itself. Often you'll find that goals and objectives in various plans and documents can be sort of incompatible and difficult to reconcile. Attribution and determining causation is also a really tricky thing when it comes to trying to determine governance effects, right? So did governing in a certain way lead to certain outcome? Plans are kind of strategic in nature, they involve people and politics, and you sort of can't really rely on sort of the more hard scientific methods like we might be used to with a lot of other evaluation, where you have control groups and quasi-experiments and statistical approaches. It becomes a lot more difficult to do that with governance. And often there's also a lack of capacity, so resources may be used up in project delivery, and it's kind of like an afterthought that might get done as a way to kind of, tick the box of, this project must have some evaluation, so yeah, we had something. So often it's not maybe done as thoroughly as it could do. This is probably quite a big one, and that is the idea of change or risk-adverse organisational cultures. When you think of the concept of evaluation, it comes with that sense of judgment, doesn't it? And I think with that, it's often therefore used politically to perhaps attack political opponents, for example, if the results of an evaluation are more than negative. And ideally, you would want to be able to sort of use it more for the normative sense, which is one of a learning experience. And of course, there's somewhat of an addiction to making new plans. Everyone likes to move on with a new project, and that is also something that commonly happens here. Now, there is some, there's been some quite thorough approaches to looking at governance already in the Reef space. I've got a couple here. There's the sort of one that's you see a lot of in the Reef 2050 plan at the moment of management effective approach. There's the governance systems analysis, which sort of looked at where most need is and where most risk is, and trying to sort of put those things together. And Tiffany gave us a very nice overview of her research before on polycentric governance evaluation as well. So the thing I want to introduce today comes down to this sort of difference in approach. And in spatial planning, we often call this the difference between conformance and performance approach. So the conformance approach is the common method of project evaluation that most people are familiar with. Did the project do what it said it would do? You know, you had a plan to achieve a certain effect. Was effect achieved? Was the outcome reached? And within the Reef space, there's, you know, that's done quite well and quite extensively, and every project has very detailed evaluation of that nature. However, is that appropriate for a governance setting? And that's where the second box there comes in, which is the concept of performance evaluation. And this is perhaps more about, rather than the outcome per se, it's more about how the plan was used. And it's a bit of a reconceptualisation of what the plan is. So if you're considering the plan as purely a blueprint that you have and you follow step by step through to get to said outcome, then, you know, your conformance approach is perhaps entirely applicable. But is that what highly strategic level plans are? Especially when the people who create the plan maybe don't have agency for the various sort of subordinate actions that need to happen within that plan. Is it right to then sort of say, well, we're just looking at what came out of that? Or is it instead a way of looking at, well, what is this document trying to do? What is your plan trying to do? And in that kind of strategic level, perhaps you could see the plan as something as a communicative device, something that's trying to deliver a message. So therefore, success under a performance evaluation would be that the message of the plan is received and a logical decision flows from there, in which case you can say the plan has been successful in conveying its message. And it's an important distinction, I think, because when you're dealing with these highly politicised, large-scale, strategic-level plans, you do need to be able to recognise the uncertainties that exist when it comes to making a particular decision. You need to be able to account for partial success and to permit alternative strategies that perhaps are more attuned with the current realities rather than a strict adherence to a plan that, you know, as we all know, often by the time you finish making a very significant plan, it may be outdated by the time it actually gets published. So you need to be able to have decision makers taking on key messages and acting on those. And that's what the performance approach tries to bring in. The third one I've got there as well, I think is also quite useful, and this is the plan quality approach, and I think this is done fairly extensively. So, you know, does the plan have the things it ought to have? Did it use the appropriate processes? Those sorts of things are what are wrapped up in a plan quality approach. With the conformance and performance approaches, there is some kind of tension between these different things. Conformance proponents will argue that performance evaluation alone is evaluation avoidance, that it's trying to kind of hide from the real and tangible outcomes of what occurred. Whereas the performance proponents will argue that strict conformance evaluations are too dogmatic and unrealistically treat plans as blueprints rather than decision-making tools. So, of course, I sit on the fence a bit and say, let's do both, basically. And I think for a governance monitoring approach, it's good to have both of these things. I think the performance evaluation component is particularly important for a governance evaluation. But I think it's also necessary to combine that with understanding of the outcome. And plan quality as well is also necessary there. Basically, if you have conformance without performance, you don't know if it's a fluke. So did the outcome happen? Did that happen because of how the plan was used and managed, or did it just happen because it was going to happen anyway? And performance without conformance, well, we don't know what the result is, whether there's any practical benefit. So combining allows for analysis that seeks connections between governance and the applications of plans and policies, and hopefully outcomes as well.
Sorry, Mark, you are at 8-ish minutes.
Oh, okay, right, that's gone quick. So I'll just make this my last slide then. And I guess the idea is, well, why would you bring this into the Reef space? And I think there's actually a lot of connections between the work I've done in urban planning and in plan evaluation and the Reef space. I think there's quite a lot of similarities, particularly when you look at those very strategic level plans, let's say the Reef 2050 plan. So there's a hierarchy of plans that are used to primarily guide decision making. Plans manage and guide a diverse range of stakeholders to achieve plan objectives, and they have very large and diverse sets of stakeholders, multiple government, non-government actors, traditional owners, a whole bunch of different types of people, down to everyday community people as well. And they have direct implications for the rights and interests of people, organisations, and therefore are both inherently political in how they operate. And of course, they also involve very long-term horizons that require decisions and plans to be responsive to a dynamic world, which is why that blueprint-based approach, I think, is perhaps, at a strategic level, is perhaps less applicable. So for those reasons, I think this is this is a conceptual piece that I'm putting out there. I don't have research to show you on the reef space of this at this point, but I thought I would share this with you as a way of sort of perhaps seeing whether this would be something that could be used. And I very much appreciate your comments on that. Thank you. Yes, Gillian.
Hey, Mark. Oh, is this working? Yes. I just wanted to, while I was looking at the conformance and the performance sort of criteria, and I was wondering sort of what value does that add to the traditional KEQ headings of appropriateness, effectiveness, efficiency, those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think it probably gets into a little more detail. It's particularly getting around what is happening with the decision. So, you can sort of say, well, effectiveness, we know that sort of probably fits into the conformance component. Appropriateness, probably it fits into there a bit more. But I think it would really be getting down to looking at decisions. Either, there's a range of methods you could use for it, sort of, from content analysis of, meeting minutes, that's probably the least favourable, to actually speaking to decision makers and asking, well, what did you do with this plan? How did you use it? And, I studied anthropology as my undergrad degree, and I would love to do some sort of participant observation work in this kind of space as well. It'd be really interesting as a way to get there. So I think it fits in there. It's just what those questions are, and I think they should be tailored specifically around the how the plan was used. Beauty, thank you.
So that concludes our presentation section of today, and I'd just like to recognise and thank all of our presenters. I realise 6-minute presentation is quite a challenge, so thank you all for rising to the challenge, and I'm sorry if there wasn't enough time for questions for some of you, and I hope that there will be follow-up afterwards if you have more questions. I'd also like to thank Umberto Baresi, otherwise known as the Voice of God, for the day. So thanks, Umberto.